If you're just joining in, welcome to the 101 Mixing Tricks Q&A webinar for April 2016. And we have a lot of questions, but again, in the chat, you can ask any questions that you'd like, and I promise I'll get to them. So let's get started. Here's the first one. Oh, yeah, before we get started, if you're not a member of the Facebook group, I encourage you to do so. It's a dedicated group. It's only open to those of you in 101 Mixing Tricks. That's all. If you're not a subscriber to 101 Mixing Tricks, you can't get in. The only thing I can ask, though, is sometimes I can't tell who you are because of the screen name that you have on Facebook. So if I don't let you in for some reason, just send me an email or a comment on the website, or whatever. Find a way to ping me through Facebook, and I'll make sure I let you in, because sometimes I can recognize you and other times I can't. So once again, if you're not being let in within the first day, then let me know, and I'll make sure that you do get in to the Facebook group. It's been pretty cool so far. Lots of good questions, lots of really good feedback, and thanks for everyone for participating. Here's the first question from John. It actually has a couple of questions. First one, to bounce or not to bounce? There are times I feel a bit superstitious and record my mixes in real time, and then sometimes I bounce to stereo mix. I personally hear no difference, and some engineers agree with me. Your thoughts, please. Well, I always do an internal bounce. And that's only because of the way I work. That being said, there's a lot of reasons to play it out. What I mean is, you play the song through and you record it on 2 new tracks. And a lot of engineers like to do that, so they have everything all in the same mix. And also, the reason why you might want to do that is to add additional processing on the stereo bus. So it's different from what you're hearing. And in many cases, that happens as well. And sometimes you're printing a mix minus at the same time. As a matter of fact, I just spoke with Michael Frondelli yesterday, who's a great mixing engineer, and that's what he does. So this is kind of appropriate that this question comes in. But frankly, it's just faster for me to do it. Many times I need the speed. And with just about every DAW except the early Pro Tools, you're going to export 3 to 10 times the speed of the song. So sometimes that's more important to me, especially when you're doing multiple versions and you have to print out 10 different versions. Boy, I'd much rather do that than print them all out, than play them all out. So I hope that answers your question, John. Let's see. John has another question. I do not have any nostalgia for recording and mixing in analog. Those that do have never worked in the medium. How true. However, I get clients that insist on doing so when they realize that they're limited to 24 tracks and need to lock up a second machine to get 48, not to mention the cost of the tape stock. They reluctantly change their minds. As a consolation, I offered to run the mix through a console after the mix is all approved and all the DAW plugins are in place. How would you deal with the client in such a situation? Well, I certainly agree with you. I love analog going through a console, and I love playing Pro Tools out, or whatever your DAW is, playing it through a console. That being said, don't use much on the console. Most of it's still done in the box. It's just the sound of the console itself that makes it sound better. But I don't hear that much of a difference on tape that's for the better. I don't have any nostalgia for it, and frankly, it's just it's a pain for not too much advantage. And I've told this story before. If you've heard this, forgive me, but a few years ago, I did a blues record that the artist insisted on doing it to tape, against my recommendation, by the way. And it was a huge pain. And the record actually did well. It went to number 2 on the Billboard Blues charts. So that was the good part. But the fact of the matter was, it was expensive with the tape. And there were a lot of situations where, first of all, you'd want to do another vocal track. Oh, no, we don't have any left. So that's the problem. But even bigger for me was the fact when you're tracking, and now you want to track another take of the song, and you go, wait, it's a 4-minute song. I only have 3 minutes and 50 seconds left of the tape. So you have to roll it off and wait for that to happen. Go find another reel, roll it back on. And in the meantime, it's about 10 minutes till you do that, and the band has lost the vibe. So for me, I don't see too much of an advantage of doing it that way. So I always use those examples to a client that wants to track to tape. Again, analog through a console, yeah, I love it. Do it all the time, and I'd suggest that way. But other than that, no, I don't see the advantage personally. I'm not nostalgic for that tape sound. And you know what? A lot of diehards that I used to know that have changed their mind on that. So not in the majority or in the minority anymore on it. Okay, next question from Stan. Oh, yeah, okay. And Stan sent this to me yesterday. He says he has a drum sample from the last Bon Jovi album, and wondering, how do you get a drum sound like that? See the frequency band screenshot. There's a loop underneath the drums, but still, this has a larger than life drum sound. Leaves me puzzled. Okay, here's what he sent to me, and hopefully you guys will hear this. Let's play it again. And I just looked, it doesn't look like that was actually playing out. I'm going to try something else, and let me see if I can have that work here. Okay, you guys may have heard it and maybe not, and I apologize. That was sometimes this works and sometimes this doesn't when I play things out. This is an easy one, Stan. Really, it's reverb, and reverb that's on the kick. Okay, yeah, I hear from everybody. Nope, can't hear it. No audio here. Yes, but very quiet. Sorry. Okay, guys, what this was a sample that had a lot of reverb on it. And the reverb was also on the kick, which we normally don't do. But as soon as you begin to put reverb on a kick drum, for some reason, the entire drum sound just sounds bigger. It sounds enormous. This is also the secret to the Tommy Lee drum sound. So if you go look at that trick, that's basically what you're hearing here on the Bon Jovi track. So Stan, I hope that answers your question. Oh, wait, come back. Here we go. It's a long one from Gary. Okay, this is about one of this. I don't remember the mix trick, and I'm sorry. I should have put it down here. But he says you move the DI track to line up with the mic track. Then you said you move the mic track forward to line up with the DI. Okay, what this was in one of the tricks, and boy, I don't know these by heart. I guess I should. What happens is, if you have a mic'd bass and a DI, if you go look at them very closely, you'll find that the mic'd one is a little behind, a few milliseconds behind. And that makes sense because it takes a little longer for it to go out to the amplifier, be recorded, and go through the microphone, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little behind the direct. And usually by moving one track or the other, so they both line up, they're in phase, and it just sounds a little bit bigger and fuller and fatter. And what I did was I moved the DI track backwards so it lined up with the mic. But in the summary, I said, move the mic track forward to line up with the DI. And this is my fault for not explaining this further. Sometimes I like to line up the bass a little behind the kick. And the reason for that is, and you'll find this naturally happens many times with bass players and drummers, where there's just a natural hole in between the kick and snare where the bass fits. It's very small. It's only a few milliseconds. But what it does, it sounds fuller, but it also makes the bass sound a little bit more defined. So many times I'll move them both back a little bit. So that happens. Obviously, it has to be a bass player that's really tight and really together. So, and it works a lot better if you have program tracks, believe me, where everything is, very precise. With that being said, that's the reason why, Gary, I did that. Okay, he goes further. Sometimes I like to move the bass back female, so it speaks better in the mix. Yeah. This would put the bass out of phase with the kick drum to some extent. I was wondering about this idea in a previous email. In real life, kick and bass are never exactly in phase anyway, and our ears hear them as distinctly separate sounds. Sometimes the bass is pushing or right down the middle or laying back in an almost detached feel. And basically he says, early recordings of the Beatles, the Meters, the Crusaders, to name a few, are great examples of this. Yeah, that's exactly right, Gary. I think it's rare when you find the bass player and drummer exactly on. And usually I won't edit it so they are on, except for a couple of places when I go in and edit. I'll make sure that on any major hits or accents, things like entrances, where the band starts at the same time or stops at the same time, those I make sure are right on because that sounds better. But everything else in between, if it's too right on, the bass and the kick we're talking about, uh, one covers up the other sometimes, and there's not as much definition, and it just doesn't sound as big. So, and it doesn't sound as human as well. So that's why I watch. I'm very careful about how much I actually edit that stuff. Okay, from Anders. In the part of get your vocals a cut through the mix, I have a question. You say copy the vocal track. Should I copy the track without any plugins or with? Okay, and what this is on most of the vocal tricks, and many of the vocal tricks, you have to copy the track. So in other words, you have this vocal track and then you make a copy of it, and then you manipulate the copied vocal track. I think the airy vocal trick is one that I can think of off the top of my head. And no, what you do is you'd copy it, and you could do it either way. You could leave the plugins in, but usually you're better off not to because you're going to process it a separate way, and you're going to EQ it differently. You're going to compress it differently. So you can leave the plugins, but just know that you'll probably change the settings. So just don't be afraid about that. So generally, that's what I do. If in fact you want it to sound as close to the same, then you'd probably leave the plugins. So for instance, on a double, you would probably leave the plugins. And I'm talking about a true double, for instance. You'd want to leave the plugins. But normally, no, it's not something you'd worry about. But he also says, I tend to get a chorus-like sound from the combined channels. Yeah, the reason for that is you don't have delay compensation on. So the duplicated channel with the effects are a little bit behind. And if you zoom in on the timeline, you'll see that there's a difference. So you'd want to put the delay compensation in, and if you get that chorus-like sound. It's a flanging sound. And what you want to do is move that track up so it's aligned with your original track. By the way, that happened in many of the 101 mixing tricks where I didn't have delay compensation on some of the drum tracks, for instance. I'm going to go back and redo those so we don't have that. But those are good examples where delay compensation wasn't on. Why it wasn't, I don't know, and why I didn't hear it, I don't know. But nonetheless, it does happen. Okay, let's see. Salah says, I use Cubase program. Do you want to use this program in the lessons of the mix and mastering? Well, I think what he means here is, are you ever going to do any 101 mixing tricks just for Cubase? And the best I can say is perhaps. We've thought about actually doing that and having a whole separate 101 mixing tricks just for Cubase, for Logic, off the top of my head, for Studio One, maybe some others. I don't know if it's a good idea and worth all the effort. Why don't you guys tell me? Would that be better for you, or can you get what you want from the 101 mixing tricks the way they are now? The tricks are pretty generic, and the way they're laid out in such a way where I think you can copy them to just about any DAW or console. The concepts are the same. Nothing changes there. Maybe the way you do it is different, but other than that, the concepts are the same. So anyway, you guys let me know. You tell me, and that will determine what we'll do. Okay, Adrian says, I was wondering if you have any microphones you would recommend for upright piano for more rock style like Jerry Lee Lewis or Fats Domino. Yeah, probably dynamic mics. Um, it's funny because back in those days, you either had large diaphragm, great microphones, C12s, U47s, things like that, U67s a little bit later, or you had dynamic mics. You had Electro Voice, especially the old RE15s, RE16s, things like that. And it was even before the SM series came out, SM57s, the Shure 57s, 58s. Those will work, but they're even using older Shure mics than that. So that's a way to get that sound. It's more dynamic mics than it is anything at that point. But the other thing is, it's also the player means a whole lot. It's the touch of the player, the sound of the piano. So it's not just the microphones, it's everything else, but I would start with the mics first. And if you have a player that plays like Jerry Lee or Fats, you're most of the way there, actually. Okay, Tracy asks, do you ever have tracking workshops or videos? Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you go over to lynda.com, I did a very extensive course over there. It's audio recording techniques. And we recorded just about everything, all sorts of different instruments. And you can see instruments, amplifiers, everything you can think of. Some great players. It was some of the guys from Steely Dan's band, actually. And it was just terrific. So there's horns on there. There's strings even. So lynda.com, just do a search for Bobby Owsinski and you'll find audio recording techniques. And that's a good way to do it. Actually, if you want, let me know. I'll send you a free 7 days, a link. You'll get a free 7-day subscription. So if you want that, drop me an email. Okay, Gary again. I've been mastering some of my original music compositions. When I have what I think is a good final mix when mastering, I find the levels are very hot and subsequently squashed to hell. I suspect that the mastering, compression, maximizing, and final limiter are raising the levels too much. To this end, I have a question. What are the best instrument power levels in a mix before going to mastering? When mastering, these levels all come up to be more prominent. And what Gary did is he put a whole chart of the levels of his various instruments in the mix it's way too long to put here. And he goes on, it'd be good if you can give me some guidance here, as these are still not working out as well as I would like. Are there a set of guidelines for these power levels? Well, no, there's no standard for that. Here's the thing. Great engineers, mixing engineers, and great mastering engineers, they do everything by ear. They listen and they figure it out that way. They don't use meters so much, maybe to get started, but that's about it. They don't use power levels. Sometimes, if when you master and it screws up your mix, two things can happen. It could be the it just isn't hanging together well. And you'd be surprised the number of times a mastering engineer will go back to the mixer and say, you know what, you ought to do this again. It happens more than you think, or even great mixers could miss it. So don't feel bad if that happens. When you begin to master something and it just isn't hanging together, maybe it's the mix. And sometimes the mix is squashed too much. It could be individual channels, individual tracks are squashed too hard. It could be the whole mix is squashed too hard. But usually when you start to see levels and everything going out of balance, it usually means that it's being squashed way, way, way too hard. It could be that your ratio is too high in your compressors. And the best ratio is low, 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 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, something like that. That's the best. And that will give you the best dynamics. Let's put it like that. The other thing it could be is your attack and release times aren't set correctly. And usually it means the attack is too fast. So those are some of the things right there. Maybe you're squashing it more on the limiter than you are in the compressor. Usually you go in the compressor, not so much on the limiter. So that could be that, but it's all comes down to your ears. And hey, that's why, really great mixing engineers and mastering engineers get paid the big bucks. Okay, next one. Anders asks, the New York compression trick. I believe I heard that you take the signal from the drum group. Is that right? That means the hi-hat and cymbals are included. Yes, you can do it like that. There's a couple ways. You can take it just from your drum bus. So the New York compression trick, just so everybody knows what it is, it's a mix bus where you have the compressor, where you add a compressor and you compress it really hard. You add an EQ after that, and you give it a smiley face EQ. Lots of highs, lots of lows. And then you add the drum mix in. And then you move that new compressed subgroup up underneath the original track, and it just gives you some extra oomph, some extra girth, some extra power. Yes, you can add the hi-hat and the cymbals and everything else in. However, sometimes you're better off if you don't. Sometimes you're better off if you just take a stereo send, and it might be just the kick and snare that you'll use. And that will do the trick for you. Sometimes it might be the kick and snare and toms as well, without any of the cymbals. It all depends on the song, on what you need, and depends on the drummer. If the drummer is hitting the cymbals a lot or really hard, and they're hard to get out of the mix, then I definitely would not put the cymbals in the New York City compression track subgroup. So again, it always comes down to it depends. It depends on the song, on the arrangement, on the players. There's so much that it starts there first before anything else. The room, maybe it's a reflective room. So as a result, you're hearing all sorts of stuff you don't want to hear, and especially from the hi-hat, overheads, things like that. So that would determine how much of that I use. Hope that helps, Anders. And Jeff asks, and Jeff actually says, one thing I've done a couple of times on left and right guitars is to find a frequency area where each guitar sounds particularly good, then boost a few dB on one while cutting a few dB in the same frequency in the opposite guitar. Seems to help each one stand out from the other. Yeah, I mean, that's a basic trick. It's frequency juggling. That's what we do all the time. When you have, and it doesn't matter on guitars, it could be any track. If, for instance, you find the snare and the vocal fighting, then you look and you see, well, wait a second, are they both boosted in the same place? And if they are, well, maybe the best thing is to move the frequency up on one a little bit higher. So if one is boosted at 2.1, if they're both boosted at 2.1K or somewhere around there, then maybe if you move the other one up to 2.5 or a little higher, then all of a sudden it straightens that out and you can hear them both. Sometimes you keep the one boosted and you cut the other, which is what Jeff is saying here, and that's exactly, that's the whole secret of EQing. That's what we all do. You boost some, you cut, and you cut other things, and or you'll boost in different places, and that's what makes everything kind of stand out. That's the whole trick. Easier said than done, but yeah, that's the way to do it. Okay. I just want to remind you, I've been reminding you as well in emails, and I'm sorry if I sent too many out, but my mixing workshop is coming up real fast, May 14th and 15th. There's still a couple places. We're going to be actually at Clear Lake Audio, which has been around for 30 years. It has one of the biggest control rooms, a nice tracking room as well, one of the biggest control rooms in town, and that's one of the reasons why we're going there, so we can put a lot of people there. And it has some um, a nice lounge and stuff like that, and that's where we'll be. So again, it's 1497, and then for people that aren't in 101 mixing tricks, it's 997, and for you guys, it's 747. And the way you get that, go to Bobby Owsinski Courses, use the coupon code Early Mix. Early Mix. There's still a couple of places, and we're still far enough away where you can still get some good airline tickets, and there's lots of places to stay, so that's not a problem. Okay, now let's get to the live Q&A. So there's already a lot of questions here, and let's start first with James. What kind of effect does compression have on increasing or decreasing certain frequency ranges? I'm specifically thinking about what kind of EQ may need to be applied after compressing to compensate. Yeah, well, okay. You know what I'm going to do? I am going to here we go. Stop screen sharing so you can see me. A little more personal, I think. So, James, yes, what tends to happen is you'll find that depending on the compressor, certain frequencies are more affected than others. For instance, most compressors tend to really have an adverse effect on the low end. So if you add, like on drums, for instance, a kick drum, you add a compressor, and usually you'll have to compensate a little by adding a little bit of low end EQ, and that's kind of standard. There are some compressors in LA2A, for instance, where the high end flies through it. It sounds really good, and it doesn't sound quite as good on everything else. Now, again, it sort of depends. If you have an EQ in the signal path ahead of the compressor, that's not a good thing, because what ends up happening is if you have something boosted, that's what the compressor is going to work on first. So those frequencies are actually going to be compressed. Defeats the purpose. So what you want to do is put your EQ after the compressor, and then you won't have that problem. So that's a real standard thing. Occasionally you might find someone put the EQ first, but usually it's behind the compressor, and you won't have as many of those problems. But yeah, it really depends on the compressor, and that's why people change them all the time and have a bunch of different alternatives, because there are certain things that work really well with certain instruments because of how they affect the frequencies. Okay, let's see. Here's another one. Jeff says, I use Cubase. Not sure if it's worth the extra effort They're generic. Okay. Asking my questions. Alan says in the webinar content, it's general enough. Doesn't need to be DAW specific. Okay, cool. Thomas, could you explain to me what's an EQ plugin look table? If all EQ plugins use this table, is there any difference in high price EQ plugins? I'm not sure what you mean there. Thomas, could you explain to me what you mean by the plugin look table? I'm not with you on that. So just explain to me what that is or what you mean. Let's see. Richard says, I'm a sonar guy. The tricks translate fine as long as you know it's called for. Okay. Randall says, what trick will make a fabulous snare like Robert Palmer Addicted to Love? Two things. First, a great drummer and a great snare drum. It's pretty basic. It all starts there. You'd be surprised how a mediocre snare can sound with a great drummer. And I've told the story before. If you've heard it, again, forgive me, but when I was a young engineer, I recorded the Saturday Night Live band and the show Saturday Night Live. So the band came in to play. I forget, they were backing Lou Rawls, I think, and we had a rented backline, especially rented drums. And when the guy came in to tune drums, it was the drum tuner. He was tuning them, and I thought, oh, they sound pretty good. Then the drummer from Saturday Night Live came in. It was Charlie Drayton, I think. Steve Jordan. And he sat down behind the drums and he played a little bit, and he went, oh, God, these are the worst drums I've ever heard. And he was bitching and moaning about these drums all the while he's playing. And I'm thinking, wow, this is some of the best drum sounds I've ever heard. And it was so much better than the guy that was tuning them when he was playing before. So it really depends on the drummer so much, because a great drummer can make a really mediocre kit sound terrific. And also, if you have a really good sounding drum kit with the great drummer, man, it's hard to screw that up. Hard to screw that sound up. So that's a big part of it. As far as a trick to get that, boy, you got to start with a great sound first. If you can't get a great sound, if it wasn't recorded well, the best thing I can say is enhance it with the sample. Get a great sounding sample. Don't replace it, but enhance it. Just add it to it. And that happens a lot in mixing, and that will do it. Okay, let's see. From James. I've heard it said that a good mix will sound good on every sound system. You think that's an overstatement, or is it better to say a good mix will sound acceptable on most sound systems? Well, the thing, what ends up happening with a good mix, you can have a great mix that doesn't translate well, and it does happen sometimes. It's always happened. And I go back to the 1980s when A&M Records, which is one of the hot studios in LA, they had their own AM transmitter out in the back, low power. And what they would do is they'd transmit into, the artist's car or the producer's car, so they can hear what it sounds like on, a little car radio speaker, just to be sure. This is before we started using R-tones and stuff like that. So no, great mix doesn't always translate. And that's why you want to use the trick in module number 1, where you listen at different levels, the low level balance trick. You'll find that if you have your level down at whisper level, where it's very quiet, and if it works there, it's probably going to work most of the time. The other thing I would always do is I would always get the crappiest pair of computer speakers and play them over those. And if they work there, they'll probably work anywhere else. And put them through your laptop or whatever. Put the mix through your laptop and listen there. But that's what I would do. So no, it doesn't necessarily mean it will work everywhere. It might work most places, but not everywhere. Okay, Greg says, to use a cloud lifter or other signal booster on your SM7 or preamp you're using currently on yours. No, I don't use any of that. I have to say that I've considered changing from the SM7. I like the sound because it is such a low level. And I have to crank it, and there is some noise that really bugs me. And I should probably put on a cloud lifter because the noise does bug me. What I'm using here in my home studio for this is a 1073 clone. And it's a fairly inexpensive clone. It's a Golden Age. Golden Age, what is it? I can't see the number on it. It's a pre-73, I think it says. Which works great. Works great for this application anyway. And frankly, I have some much better preamps, but they're in studio, so I don't bring them home to use. And this is kind of a permanent setup. It doesn't change, and it works fine. I'm also going through a Warm Audio 1176 clone, and I really like that as well. And I have a bunch of those. I also have some real deal 1176s. Believe me, these are really good. They're really close. So it works for me. Okay. Jeff P. Going back to your adding a sample to poor sounding drums, is there a way to automate syncing the sample with the original drum hits? Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. There's a mixing trick for this. I can't remember where. Well, it's in the drum module. It's in module number 4. And I think it's called the old-fashioned drum replacement trick. So this is the way we used to do it in the old days, and you can do that. You're much better off with a program that does that. And there's lots of them. There's just any of the really good drum programs, BFD, Easy Drums, any of those, and there's tons of them, and they all work pretty well. Some work better than others. Slate Digital has a good one. Some people like some and don't like others. It's a matter of taste, like a lot of these things, but that's the easiest way because they do a much better job. So that's what I would use. Let's see, anybody else have any questions? I don't see anything here. Okay, last chance, everybody. I'm gonna go back to my screen here. Okay, any more questions? If not, I want to thank you for being here. Don't forget, join the Facebook group. The only people that can get in are the people on 101 Mixing Tricks. That's all. You have to be a subscriber. It's pretty vital. There's lots of stuff going on over there. It's a good way to get questions answered real fast. And don't be afraid to share any questions or share any problems or share any tricks that you find as well. So that's pretty cool. Okay, here we got another one from James. Can you talk about upward compress? If I'm correct, most of what I hear about in workshops is downward compression. Yeah, upward compression, that's expansion. And really what that is there's there's actually I'm trying to think of the best way to approach this. There's a trick that uses an enhancer, an expansion device. I'm trying to think of where it's at, but there is a trick that shows you that. There's lots of them. There's lots of very cool upward compression tricks. A lot of times people use it to get rid of distortion. As a matter of fact, I was just having a conversation with Dave Pensato about this, and he gave me a list of 5 different ones that he liked that I'll pass on to the group. And the other thing is, with expanders, there's also a trick for that. And look, I think it's called the secret gate technique, something like that. Boy, I should know all of these. Actually, next time I come to a Q&A, I'm going to have a list of all of them beside me so I can give you the right ones here. Probably should do that. Anyway, what happens is instead of the gate going to 0 when it closes, for instance, the gate would just go down 5 dB, 10 dB, whatever you so choose. And that's kind of a way that's upward expansion. And that's a way of partially closing a gate, essentially. But there are other upward expanders that work differently. And again, I will get the and I'll put it in the notes here which trick it is that you can go check out, and that will tell you more. Okay, Hans Eric, I see that you've placed the mic 90 degrees. I've tried this lately for ADR recording to avoid pops. How does it affect versus the direct sound? Do you lose important information? No, you don't. I mean, it works great. It's basically aimed at your lips. And okay, here's it straight on. It does sound a little different, I have to say. It's a little cleaner, but you'll still get some pops. This way, it's not quite as good. Maybe I should have it as a 45-degree angle. I think that's better. But that being said, it does get rid of all the pops. You don't have to worry about it. And you'll see this a lot. Television, you'll see it a lot. ADR. The other thing that you can do, and this is the best by far, and actually what I'm going to do is stop screen sharing so you can see this. So here's a way to do it. And what I'm doing is I'm placing the mic at about my nose, and I'm pointing it down at my lips. And this is another way to do it. This is a very good way to record vocals, by the way. And you won't have any P's, any pops, unless somebody looks up at it like that, and then you'll get it, but you won't get any down here. So this is the way I always record vocals, by the way, and you'll see this a lot. Look at old pictures of Frank Sinatra and those guys like that, and you'll always see the mic up like this, as a matter of fact. The other thing it does is it forces the singer to look up a little bit, and when that happens, it opens up the diaphragm. So that's a good way to do it. Okay, I think that's about it. So thank you, everybody. Let's go back to the screen. Don't forget, this is going to be posted later on today in the Q&A section of your dashboard, and you can go back and listen to any of the previous webinars, Q&A webinars. They're always posted. And I also have usually a list of the questions that were there as well. So again, oh, here, Frank just came on. Wait a second. Last question. Okay. Just logged on. You cover any sidechain stuff? I used to duck a guitar stem triggered by a vocal track. Worked great. Yeah. There's a lot of mixing tricks, 101 mixing tricks that do this. There's some for the bass, for instance. There's some that work with the guitar. There's some that work with the vocal. And it's a great way to, and there's some sidechain tricks with echo and delay, with delay and reverb, for instance, where it dips when the singer's singing, and then you hear it come up when the singer stops, or any of those other scenarios with other instruments. So it's a great trick. And again, there's 4 or 5 of those within 101 mixing tricks. And next time I'm going to bring a list of the tricks so I can cite them exactly. Greg says, great questions, great webinar. Thank you. No, thank you. I do appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for being on. And send me your comments and tell me the tricks that you like the best and what you like to see in the future. Thanks so much, everybody.